Representative Maloney, Representative Mulvaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to come back to do something that focus on something that is probably more of interest to the economists in the room than the ordinary people. I share, Mr. Hassett, your enjoyment of these committee meetings. I swear, though, I think we'll put people to sleep if we do this more frequently. Let's talk about ratios. Because what I heard you lay out, Dr. Zandi, was your sort of ideal situation. We had $1.4 trillion revenue increase, a $1.2 trillion spending reduction, and then when you add an anticipated $0.4 trillion, $400 billion interest savings, it gets you to roughly a $3 trillion deficit reduction over the course of the 10 years. That's a roughly 1.1 ratio, and then you went on to add the $1.2 trillion that we've already saved as a result of the negotiations over last year's debt ceiling. I would suggest to you, by the way, that while that does get you to 2 to 1, that the $1.2 trillion from last year is already in the baseline. So the new number would really be 1 to 1. But that's not my question. My question is, I want to go to what's actually being discussed now. And you started in response to Mrs. Maloney to lay out the president's offer. We looked at the president's offer today, and we're trying to find any spending reductions at all. What we found so far is what you mentioned accurately, the $1.6 trillion in tax increases, the stimulus spending, the extension of the unemployment insurance, which is an increase in spending, the extension of the payroll tax cut, which is really an increase, the delay in the sequester cuts, which would be a reduction in the spending reductions that we're anticipating, and then no entitlement reform whatsoever. So I guess the question I have to ask you is, does the president's current offer meet your own test of a 2 to 1 ratio? We can have a discussion later as to whether that 2 to 1 is sufficient, but do you think that what the president has offered meets the 2 to 1 test?
No, it's short. He needs to come up with more spending cuts. He needs to come up with roughly, in my calculation, about $600 billion more in spending cuts over the next 10 years. I will say, though, in the defense of the White House, I do think there are significant reforms in Medicare, Medicaid, agricultural subsidies, and other programs in the budget, at least what I looked at. And those are pretty difficult things to implement. I mean, it takes a lot of guts to propose those things, so I wouldn't discount them. I think they're important. But to answer your question specifically, I think we need more spending cuts, yes, to get to my ideal.
And I'm looking now at your testimony from page 9. It says, fourth, to achieve the 2 to 1 ratio, policymakers need to reform entitlements. You go on to say that some of the suggestions that my party's offered may be too radical for you, but I appreciate the candor, by the way, in entitlements. One of the disappointing things to me is that I do see members of the other party, most notably Mr. Hoyer, say that entitlements were on the table, although then I read the details, it said not now. They're on the table for later discussion. But I have been disappointed that all of the discussion seems to be focused on the revenue side and not on the spending side, most specifically on the entitlement side. I want to move very quickly to the debt ceiling, because there was something very interesting in your testimony that caught my attention that I was not familiar with in this form, which is your support for the initiative offered by Senator Rob Portman. And when we talk about the debt ceiling, you say separately, and I'll read now, lawmakers could adopt a version of the so-called dollar for dollar rule, first proposed by Ohio Senator Rob Portman to address the 2011 debt ceiling. Under Portman's rule, policymakers would agree at the beginning of each fiscal year to cut spending equal to the amount of the debt ceiling must be raised to cover that year's budget. Spending cuts would be phased in gradually over the following 10 years. Adopting some form of this rule would be a good safeguard in case Congress misses its deficit reduction targets. I can tell you that, while I appreciate Senator Portman's input, that was actually, I think the Speaker was talking about exactly those types of same structure, which is $1 of spending reduction for every $1 of debt increase. So my question to you, Dr. Zandi, is, isn't this exactly what we did in the BCA that now everybody's trying to get out of? We had $1 of spending reductions, 1.2 already in place, the other portion coming in the sequester, in exchange for the same amount of increase to the debt ceiling. Isn't that what we did? And if that's such a good idea, why are you and others now suggesting that it's not a good idea and we need to peel back or at least delay the implementation of the sequester cuts?
Well, let me say a few things. First, you have to put this in the broad context. So I think we need to get rid of the debt ceiling law. That is anachronistic. I think it's a problem, and we need to get rid of it. But I do think if we're going to do that, we need to have some new budget mechanisms to ensure that there's some discipline going forward. I suggest in the testimony readoption of full pay-go. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And I did also suggest that some version of the dollar-for-dollar rule should be implemented, or at least considered, both on the spending side and on the tax revenue side. It doesn't have to be one-for-one. It could be, 50%, some mechanism to make sure that that there is some future fiscal discipline. But that's now going forward. I mean, we need to, my view is we need to nail down how we get to fiscal sustainability, the $3 trillion that I propose, get rid of the debt ceiling law as it's currently configured, and adopt some budget rule. And I'm throwing that out as an idea, but we need some form of budget rule to make sure that there's some discipline going forward in terms of structure. Yeah, some structure, so that because the other thing, you can lay out a plan, but it has to be a credible plan. I mean, it's got to convince everyone that we're going to stick to this plan.
Thank you, Dr. Zandi. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Mulvaney. Senator Bingaman.